I thought we'd start with a context sort of covering challenges and opportunities at the moment, then talk about some policies and regulations and how these affect the market, then talk about the enablers, so the importance of standard setting and data harmonization, and the opportunities that digitalization and AI bring at right now to create some efficiencies. And also then to talk about sort of the consumers' action, the consumer behavior and NGO advocacy, and then also what leading companies in Europe, and quite frankly, these are also global companies that are active both in the US companies, but also in Europe. And so what they have to kind of deal with when they're selling and active in the EU market. So I hope that you find that exciting. So I just thought, okay, so what have we had? We've had some challenges in 2025 that have led, both politics and people globally to focus more on, day-to-day survival, I'd say. So changes in political leadership, these have brought new conditions. So not just in the US, but also in Germany, for example, there's a new coalition government and a number of different other countries. We have weakened regulations, both in the US and Europe. And we have, of course, these ongoing wars, increased fanaticism, and this general sense of insecurity. I think we all know this. And this is really kind of distracting people from the topic of sustainability. We've also had a weakened economy. Well, some would say it's strong, but in general, it's a weakened economy due to the tariffs and the high energy costs, which hits actually Germany very strongly. Germany has the highest energy costs. And then also, obviously, the higher cost of living that everyone's kind of, across the board, both the US and in Germany, higher rents, too high of rents, the food, the heating, et cetera. So in this context, how does sustainability continue to be relevant? I just wanted to share a few maybe research points. There's a BCG consumer study that underlined, you'll see that this was a questionnaire of folks between 24 and 25. How do you feel about each of the following topics? And the orange means, bad, and I feel good is in green, and okay is in gray. So you'll see that there has been an increase in obviously feeling that the economy is bad, 7 points, and the concern about the environment has dropped. So possibly not a surprise, but always interesting to have some facts. And this is most pessimistic, I guess, in France and the UK, and the least pessimistic are the Nordic countries, more socialist countries, and so there's a kind of a correlation there. Also, up to 75% of consumers are looking for discounts, and about half to 2/3 of consumers are willing to change their brands. So you see on the right, sort of like apparel, right? About, over 70% are willing to change brands. Why do I mention this? This is relevant because, companies obviously want to keep their consumers and their customers. So what do they have to do that? And so here also perhaps just consumers do continue to care about sustainability. So if you look at the top line, it basically has the different sectors: luxury, fashion, appliances, furniture. And consumers who regularly consider sustainability in their purchase decisions, you see it's a little bit about half or more. I think that's a pretty high number, actually, for Europe. I think if you would ask in the US, I don't know if you would get 50%. And so I kind of highlighted in red here that there's more points. There's a change from 2024. So the percentage points have gone up across the board for who regularly considers sustainability, right, in their purchasing. At the same time, their willingness to pay a premium for that has gone down. Of course, that's because the economic situations, they're just feeling tight. Budgets are tight. So leading brands have recognized that sustainability is here to stay and can deliver value through differentiation and economics. So, the companies should be prepared once this economic flout goes by, they'll, the topic of sustainability should still be there. So what they should do? They should still continue to prepare to meet the expectations of the consumers by integrating sort of attributes of the products. And there's some very interesting innovations going on in this area across the board. They should drive demand generation by really bringing in these new innovation products into their pipeline and kind of position. And we're seeing this a lot more. So sustainability used to be a little bit more about sort of compliance. Are you meeting your environmental needs, et cetera? And at least in Europe, there is a change now to it being more of a business imperative. It's being embedded into the strategy, into the governance structures. It's just starting now. That's a very good move because then you don't have to have extra budget for that. It's already part of the resilience. And why is this? Because there's higher risk. I think COVID kind of showed also how supply chains can be, disrupted, and this comes through climate change as well. So, yes, and then the last point here is that companies are looking to discuss and approach value creation through transparent marketing. So science-based metrics. It's still this is the area that's my expertise as well, strategy, communications and engagement, stakeholder engagement. And there's improvement, but there's still a ways to go to not greenwash. So that's sort of setting the context. I'm just going to take a break and ask any comments or questions so far or thoughts. Is this resonating with you? Yeah?
Just keep going.
Okay, we'll go to the next. So let's look at policies and regulations. So how they're creating, supportive market conditions for the sustainability movement, so to speak. So international, I thought that would be helpful. Many of you are probably diehards here. You might know this, but I thought I'd share anyway. So international treaties and European policies really set the strategic framework. And we know that the US has stepped out of the Paris Agreement. It is still very much a driving force for the EU. The Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. And it was actually adopted in 2016, and the 27 individual EU nation states ratified the decision. The EU submits the single joint NDC target, that's nationally determined contribution, on behalf of the EU nation states, with individual countries sort of target setting as well, but it's all about sort of supporting and creating a EU target. Certain countries pull more weight, others a little bit less, depending on their abilities. So the EU's collective climate target is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 55% by 2030. So another 4 years left. And they've already achieved 37%. It's compared to 1990. So quite frankly, that's a benefit, but that's what was set up like this. So 37% has already been achieved by 2024, and they do anticipate to go just shy of 54 if the measures that have been defined by the different countries continue to be implemented. And I think you may know that renewable energy has made quite a big jump in Europe, and I'm not sure what it is in the US, but we're on a good path there. But there are other sectors like particularly the building. I mean, the building and construction is still one of the challenges because you have such old infrastructure, and it is extremely, extremely expensive to update. And maybe a little bit side note here. So 30 years ago, when I was in Germany, I started my career, the Green Party was just starting in Germany. And, I do vote green and conservative. You have two votes because I like the economics, but I also like the green policies. And in the last coalition government, the Greens finally made it into the German national, leadership. And the director of the Green Party, one of them, actually there were two, one went into the International Foreign Services support, and then there was the other one who was leading up the economics group. And he brought in a lot of great and important topics, but it was too much for the economy, and there was quite the pushback. And even we're renovating and wanting to create, better housing with better, what do you call it? Less energy loss, right? But it's so expensive. And so it really got a backlash. They were voted out, and now it's all about how do we make a difference with it step by step. And to be honest, as a German American, sometimes I wonder, why is Germany so pent up on even, 3-pane windows when you go to Scotland or France or anywhere else, and they're just like pumping out the heat without any insulation. So that's just as an example of there are differences in quality in Europe. And so I always feel like Germany is trying to lead, but they're also having an economic disadvantage sometimes about this. If they don't then promote this into new innovation and keep those innovations. So that's part of what the Green Deal is trying to do. Okay, which is what brings me now to the Green Deal. So the Green Deal was passed in 2019. It's not a law, but it's a political and economic transformation agenda or a framework, and it seeks to set the EU up specifically for industrial leadership in clean technologies, first mover advantage via regulation, market creation for sustainable products, and reduce strategic dependencies like on energy, materials, raw materials, and technology. I just wanted to highlight that because I think that's super interesting for people to know that this is the strategic vision, right? Would love to maybe hear if we know what the US's strategic vision is. I did some research. There's different ways that the US goes about this, but not with such a comprehensive strategy. And I'm going to share with you in a moment what that comprehensive strategy involves. From a legal perspective, we have the European Climate Law, which is was passed in 2021, and it sets up, so these are like packages that you might hear, Fit for 55. It's not the age, it's the 55, percent emissions reductions. Then we have the circular economy laws. Nature and chemicals is not to be forgotten. It's not just a climate focus, it's also on biodiversity and water and other aspects, and chemicals as well has a pretty big focus right now. And then we have sustainable finance laws. So how do you make this all sustainably, financially sustainable? So the Green Deal, the European policy umbrella, creates this holistic set of instruments. And I thought I'd share the three distinct sort of strategic purposes that they have. One is market discipline and capital allocation. So the purpose here are for laws around reporting to fix information failures. So capital can move. So what does that mean? That means, having companies disclose the same type of information, having some standards around that so that there is comparability, so that investors can actually make certain decisions, so that companies can also see how they're working along these things. So here is a list of those topics. Okay, so that's the one thing. Then the next is industrial product and circularity regulation. And I think this year is going to become the year of circularity. People are just going to be talking about it a lot more than in the past. These regulatory instruments serve to drive innovation. And this makes sustainability become a market entry condition. And here you'll see a list of them. There's the Circular Economy Action Plan. There's Eco Design for Sustainable Products Regulation. And this one's going to be coming into effect this year, and more focus is going to be coming on this ESPR, Eco Design for Sustainable Product Regulations. Also, another thing that's having a deadline for countries to meet is the digital product passport. So what does that mean? That means that the information about where all the raw materials or where the processing steps were are all together on a digital sort of chip. And it's a passport so that the companies, and at the end of the day, the consumers can track back sort of where was my product produced, and what are the environmental implications. Then also getting a lot of focus is the packaging and packaging waste regulation. So here it's all about companies having to look to reduce how much plastic, how much packaging, not just plastic, but also paper and things like that, so that there's just a reduction in a number of benefits there for transport and for raw material usage. And this, I think you'll be getting the slide deck also later on, just for your information. Then there's the right to repair directive, batteries regulation, a lot around electric vehicles, and construction products regulations. And then the final purpose or set is, so we've had the market discipline, the capital allocation for the reporting, then we have the industrial product and circularity, sort of creating the innovations and the structures. And then you've got the industrial policy, scale up and technology leadership. So here, this is about how to scale the sustainable products that have been developed, how to help companies win. So those are all those regulations that foster faster adoption of these topics. And here you see Fit for 55, the Net Zero Industry Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act. I can go into that a little bit more later on if you're interested to know a little bit more about each of those. Then there's the Innovation Fund. So basically there's a tax, and then that money goes into a fund, and that then supports the development of new things. And then there's the important project of common European interest. These are transnational projects. Okay, so I thought we should take a moment just to understand some terminology, the difference between regulation and directive. And a regulation is binding in EU law, and it applies directly to all member states. It becomes law immediately once the application date has been reached. It is used when uniformity matters. And so here you see the EU taxonomy is a regulation. That is a way for companies to demonstrate what they're doing, so that these are activities that is key to their business, that has a sustainable element and is being recognized by the EU, and therefore they get some financial benefits from that. Then there's the EU deforestation regulation, the eco design for sustainable products regulation, the nature restoration law, and the EU ETS regulation, which is how the funds get sort of come. These are all things that need to be uniform in order for it to work across the EU. Then we have directives. These are binding EU law on objectives, so not on exact execution. The member states then have to transpose the directive into national law. They follow their own deadline. They have a deadline, but it's often pushed back. And they actually also, in a directive, the nation states can say how to implement something. Now, why do I share this? Because we have also had in Europe some changes and some pushback from certain countries, in particular Germany and France, that the corporate sustainability reporting directive, and I was involved in this with the company, helping them to report, and it was so detailed that it was rather difficult and cumbersome. And it cost a lot of time and money, and there was big pushback. There has been a simplification of this now, and that is a good thing. And yet some things have been watered down too much, like the bottom one here, this or the next one, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which really looks at supply chains. Supply chains is where most of companies' emissions happen. It's upstream. It's what they've purchased. It's, how that stuff is come to the company. And that's the big kahuna. We'll talk about that in a second. but anyway, I just wanted to kind of highlight what the differences are. And so there's now been some pushback in Europe. And when the CSRD came out, there was the deadline for sort of large companies with 150 million turnover that are active in Europe. So if this was a US company that had sales of 150 million in Europe, they would have to report CSRD. Now, I have heard that Trump is making that, at least some of his people are trying to intimidate some companies in California to, if you report, you're going against the law. Well, there can't be a US law against that. If they're working in Europe, there's the European law. So how is that going to be handled, right? So what I wanted to just say was that there were quite a few. This is an example of how regulation spurs activity. There were so many consultancies that were trying to help all these companies to figure this out. Quite frankly, the EU could have done a better job of making that simpler so that the companies wouldn't have to waste so much money on consultancies and have a more consistent approach. Now, because of the pushback, as soon as this omnibus, this is a word you may hear, it's called the omnibus packet, the EU said, we're going to slow everything down. We're going to take a look at this again. And ever since they made this omnibus sort of slow down, the market demand for CSRD consultancy and software just sort of dissipated, or at least they're on hold. They still need to do it because it's not just about compliance, but it helps them in defining their strategies. But it's now being delayed. So I thought it was a really interesting thing to experience, specifically on how regulation impacts what market activity is. Okay. Okay, now getting now to the consumers. So consumers have a purchasing behavior, of course, and that's very key to driving market adoption. And so yet, while environmental claims are frequent on products in Europe, they are not all sound. And the EU Commission did a number of studies and found that there is a high prevalence of vague or misleading environmental claims, lack of evidence, etc. So like, for instance, 53% here of green claims give vague, misleading, or uninformed information. It's not allowed to just say, this is an eco product. That's too vague. You have to have a more specificity. So they also found that 40% of claims have no supporting evidence. So just make the claim. I mean, I'm a marketer. I understand the temptation. But I've also learned that marketing your product features is a very different thing than marketing your product's sustainability claims. It's just, you have to handle it differently, and you have to get a lot more internal buy-in and facts to prove it. So the third point is half of all green labels offer weak or non-existent verification. This is important because there's a proliferation of different eco labels out there, and the consumer is then confused, doesn't know what that means, and the EU has decided to take action on that. So as you see here, there are about 230 sustainability labels and 100 green energy labels in the EU with vastly different levels of transparency. Yes.
There's another word for this, whitewashing or greenwashing.
Greenwashing, yes, exactly. And I'm going to share with you some principles of how to avoid greenwashing. But yes, this is the concern about greenwashing, which you see there. And this is now why the European Union is at the forefront of anti-greenwashing laws to protect consumers and to drive best practice. And we do quite a bit of support here with companies around this. So the EU has this directive called Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition. So what does that mean? They basically are saying you need to say when and how environmental comparisons between products can be made. So my product is more or less, has a higher or lower carbon footprint, or has a lower impact on water scarcity, et cetera. You can't do that unless there's a methodology of research behind that, and that has then also been used, a verified process. So that's the second point. It prohibits generic environmental claims that are not substantiated. And you'll see. So by the way, climate neutral, greenwashing. It's not allowed in Europe. The next is the EU directive. And again, these are directives, okay? So there's some flexibility. Substantiating green claims. This bans all environmental claims which do not meet a minimum set of criteria. It bans labels that do not meet minimum transparency, and it establishes a verification mechanism. That last point is what is going to be the big discussion point and challenge, because setting up a verification system for all sorts of products out there is very costly, very time consuming, and I think that's where there's probably going to be some continued debate. So this is just a slide to share with you that there's been quite an evolution in the last 3 to 4 years around sustainability or greenwashing laws, also at the national level. And if you want Germany already has had a lot of good, set up for laws that do not allow you to be, I'm thinking of the German word now, bad in competition. So those that provide poor competition comparisons, that's not allowed in Germany. Like, you can't just take advantage of that. The other ones that is France. France has been at the national level very far with the ADEME. I don't know if you've ever heard of the ADEME. It's their environmental group. And they actually go so far as you cannot use the color green to communicate that something's sustainable. So these laws also look at sort of what can you use as icons and wording. So again, here, a little bit more regulatory input. Okay, so I incorporated this so that you would have this for later. I know this is a lot of material to digest, but the reason why I was sharing this is that, there's this convergence in the wave of these EU policies under this framework, the Green Deal framework, that focuses a lot on products. And that's relevant for American companies who want to sell into Europe. So looking at the packaging and packaging waste, being able to talk and report about recyclability, reuse, circularity rules, wastewater, etc. Okay, so that's, I think, important to remember. And then we also have the UK, which is not any longer a member of the EU, but has a very strong commercial relationship with the US. So they are developing parallel systems on packaging, sourcing, and green claims. And they are also rather far along in sort of the advertising aspect. The UK is also very creative. A lot of great things coming out of the UK. So I just wanted to share that. And that's sort of the regulatory and policy framework. And then there's enablers. So, the role of standards, data harmonization, and digitalization. Again, here, the Europeans use these global standards. So it gets back to your question of, how do you make sure that people aren't just doing all sorts of different things? There's a real movement also in reporting to standardize and to harmonize across these different initiatives. So 10, 15, 20 years ago, there was, the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP. There was the Water Footprinting Initiative. So individual initiatives that sort of evolved, and others have also kind of taken on this role, like the World Resources Institute. You'll see here the third from the bottom, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. They're very much involved in establishing guidelines in collaboration with certain industries so that people are aligned and harmonized. Because unless companies and governments and policies are aligned, then you won't make any progress. So that's a real important role that NGOs are playing here. Also, so you start at the greenhouse gas protocol, the ones in red, I highlighted. I have a few additional slides because they're very important. The Science-Based Targets Initiative, and then the product footprint information is informed by life cycle assessments, the LCAs, ISO, which is the International Standards Organization, and PEF, which is the product environmental footprint. And all of these have set criteria and guidelines for sectors. Not all sectors are covered, but many of the key ones, the largest emitters are. And those other ones that are still coming, they have a plan, like I think chemistry and pharmaceuticals. We worked with the pharmaceutical companies now to develop a standard for pharmaceutical life cycle assessments, a very complex thing because of where all these ingredients are coming from. And there was a group of, I think, 13 international, primarily European, but also I think a few US ones. I think Johnson & Johnson was also part of that. Pharmaceutical companies that working together to define these standards. There's a real interest and need by companies to create standards for similar data harmonization because they all have these targets and they need to get the same information and they all share suppliers. And so that needs to be, yeah, it's a complex topic, isn't it? Anyway, okay. Okay, so let's go to the greenhouse gas protocol. So this is the global standard. It's followed by like 95% of the companies that are measuring their corporate carbon footprint. It is the most widely used global standard for measuring and managing your corporate emissions. And it's along 3 scopes. So scope 1, you'll learn some words here. Scope 1 is your direct emissions. It's from your as a company, on-site fuel combustion, any company-owned vehicles, refrigerant leaks, and direct industrial processes, okay? And then you have scope 2. Those are indirect emissions that you actually have to report from purchased electricity, steam, heating, or cooling, okay? So these 2, scope 1 and scope 2, is what companies measure and report to, and they have operational control to reduce this. And then where they have less operational control is scope 3. These are indirect emissions, and there's upstream, and there's downstream. And there's 15 categories. So you need to understand some data, get access to data. And why is this relevant? This is relevant because the biggest portion of the emissions for companies is in scope 3. So they've done quite a good job of reducing their scope 1 and scope 2 because they can manage the type of electricity they buy. They can change their manufacturing equipment to use electricity instead of propane or oil, etc. But there are certain things that they can't affect. And this is the big kahuna. It's like 80 or 90% of the emissions for a corporate carbon footprint are in the indirect emissions area, scope 3. So when we talk to companies, they're like, oh my God, where are we going to get all this data? And it really is sort of a nightmare for many of them because they have it in Excel spreadsheets, they have PDFs, they have, anyway, but it doesn't stop them. And it's always good to start because over time it improves. And the more they do it, the more efficient that they become and the better the quality is. And so Why? Because they have to do annual updates. Once you have a corporate carbon footprint, you measure it annually. And you also, once you have a corporate carbon footprint, communicate the results, and this increases your brand reputation. It's also often required. Why is this relevant, again, to US companies who supply big brands in Europe, who are reporting. The big brands in Europe, the leading companies, have measured their corporate carbon footprints. They have set targets for reduction. And so they want to now know from you, an American company that supplies part of the ingredients or products, what is your portion, so that I can get better at managing that, work with you. It's not a like, oh, no, but, work with you, the supplier, on improving this. And then once they do a corporate carbon footprint, as I said, they set their science-based targets. This creates the platform for them to do an emissions reduction roadmap. What are the actions? People call them climate levers, climate action levers. Basically, what do they do to reduce their emissions? There's a lot of things they can do, and part of which is also engaging suppliers. So now I wanted to talk to you about another standard framework that is used to define and validate your science-based targets. And the SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, has, it was created by 4 international organizations, the UN, the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, formerly known as, the World Resources Institute, which is in Washington, DC, and World Wildlife Fund. And they basically have worked with the private sector to tackle the climate change. So setting SBTs, as we call that in the industry, science-based targets, is considered the gold standard by some companies, but some companies have been delisted. So science-based targets initiative started maybe I'm misstating myself, but probably about 5 years ago, really strongly. And more companies said, okay, on the bandwagon, I'm going to set my science-based targets, which means how many emissions are they going to reduce by 2030? What percentage of their emissions will they reduce by 2050? Maybe you've heard of the topic net zero. A company wants to be net zero by 2050. That means that what they put out and what they put in is they're still producing emissions, but they're reducing it. And there's a balance. And so, sorry, that's probably, it's reaching a certain target of 1.5%. We already know that we're past the 1.5 degrees change in comparison to pre-industrial emissions levels. So yeah, this is important, but we were talking about this earlier. We all have these, we've measured, we've set targets, we're taking action, and yet we continue to have higher and higher greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
There's a banner, every 10th of a degree matters.
Yeah. Okay, Science-Based Target Initiative has 5 steps. I just wanted to show you, you commit to it, you develop your targets, then you submit it, then those are validated by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and then you can communicate about it. And then every year you actually have to update it. And if you have any kind of changes, if the company has bought or sold some other company, and that makes a significant difference to their revenues, then they have to recalculate everything because the baseline's different. So
to whom do they submit?
They submit to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. It's an NGO.
Okay.
And this is the role of NGOs in standards. That's the whole thing, that they really play this global sort of harmonization and validation role. They're changing some of the things. It would be too far to get into that now, but check them out. It's always good to know what's going on with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Sorry, just one other thing. This is the process for carbon. for climate change. Science-based targets has also created a whole science-based targets for nature standard methodology. And that's pretty cool, but it's also difficult. So they do. So the difference between doing a science-based target for climate versus nature is that climate is not tied to a location, right? Once the emissions are out there, they're out there. In order to understand your nature impacts or your nature footprint on water toxicity, on land use or land use change, or biodiversity, you need to understand the actual location.
So it's place-based.
It's place-based, and that's where the challenge is. You have to understand primarily, again, the scope, the impact comes from where the raw materials are coming from. And not everyone has that level of granularity of transparency to that level, because, think about where you're buying, getting your ingredients or your clothing. Yes.
Are agricultural suppliers active in this?
Very much so, very much so. And so this is where, getting back to the question of sort of digital tools. So geospatial, so technology is playing a big role here, because you can use geospatial technology to monitor the amount of drought in an acre or kilometer or whatnot. I mean, there's amazing granularity available through satellite and through digital GIS, geospatial technology. And so, yes, they're involved in that. But again, it's more and more, you have to start. You see the need, the startup starts, somebody develops it, they get bought by a larger one. And that's just, the process of life. Okay, so again, back to consumers. So now we talked about corporate carbon footprint. We talked about science-based targets at the corporate level. And now I just wanted to share a little bit about sort of standards for products, the product level. So consumers continue to be interested in product sustainability. And you'll see here, like, for instance, 71% increase in global online research or global online searches in Google for sustainable goods in the last 10 years. 80% of consumers say they think about sustainability in their day-to-day purchases. This is supported by the most recent BCG study that I shared at the beginning. And 75% of consumers think brands should do more to reduce their carbon footprint. So in this context, you need to be able to say, what is my product carbon footprint or my product environmental footprint? And so this is what one calls a life cycle assessment, LCA. And it's a methodology that assesses this. And there's a set methodology. It's called also the PEF methodology, the ISO methodology. And you look at going from the raw material production through manufacturing, through packaging and distribution, then the use. So clothing has quite a bit of a water footprint because you're washing the clothing, right? For example, and then there's the end of life. How are you getting rid of the product? Are you putting it into landfill? Are you incinerating it? Are you reusing it? And then, which would be the recycling. And so that's sort of the product life cycle. And then what the ISO, the International Standards Organization, they have the methodology. They look at specifically and lay out that you can measure the product life cycle by climate change, so carbon, water, ecosystem quality, there's eutrophication, there's actually 16 environmental indicators. Most of them don't really get communicated about because most people at the moment still just care about carbon, the carbon footprint. But water is also important, etc. Okay, and LCA delivers many benefits beyond substantiating environmental claims for customer communications. You do an LCA to inform your company's eco-design. What products are the most impactful, and companies are starting to do this, right? They're starting to map their products based on the high footprint versus the lower footprint, those that they can exchange different raw materials for, etc. You use an LCA to compare products. You use it also to encourage your suppliers to get engaged, and you obviously also need it to create, comply with green claims regulations. Again, standards and guidelines play an important role in driving this. So ISO and the FTC green guides, as well as the UN environmental product sustainability information, they all address these topics. And summarized, you have 5 best practices. So you should be specific, and this is getting back to how do you communicate about this, right? And do you have substantiation? So you have to be specific. You should be saying exactly what of the percent impact you have. It should be measurable, right? So you should actually have a methodology that you're measuring it with. It should be relevant. This is, some people like to talk about, this was, I think, who was it? Some airline or something, they said, our pens are made from recycled plastic. It's so irrelevant, it's the fuel that's important here, right? So that's, it needs to be relevant. It needs to be understandable. So here people often use equivalencies. Something is, as much of driving, the carbon impact is as much as driving around the world for the earth for 2.
Or equivalent for saving so many trees.
Exactly. So one has to make it understandable. It's okay to do that, but one has to have also be very clear about the assumptions you have. And then this is the point of accessibility that you brought up earlier. You do need to make the report and the statistics, the substantiation, accessible. How did you go about this? So people include QR codes, or they, put a link to the report. And again, so this is here. So I just wanted to, I know that we're getting a little bit towards the end. There was a question about digitalization. So software tools are really proliferating across the market. And so I would give it another 4 years, and these are then going to consolidate. So there's no clear market leaders yet. Quickly, things are outdated because some regulations are changing or this and that's changing. Suppliers are using different types of things. Companies use multiple tools, and they receive they're using different platform services differently. So this is the challenge right now. So technology has an opportunity to provide efficiencies and save time, but because there's so many different tools out there, it's not yet harmonized. APIs, so which is how you connect different IT solutions. There are open APIs are being developed for this, and AI does help with evaluating some of the trends that they use for this, as I said. Okay, wrapping up. I just wanted to share here that consumer advocacy groups are vigilant in reviewing the claims and legal compliance. So, and the companies really kind of listen because they have a legal liability. They suffer under tarnished brand reputation and trust, and the competitors are always watching. As I said, some companies have switched to green hushing, particularly in the US. We know this from some of our clients. They know that they need to continue with sustainability because it's an issue of business resilience for them. But they can't really talk much about it. This actually conceals progress and makes targets less transparent. So here I just brought an example of Fridays for Futures. Fridays for Future, big issue, right? During COVID and through Greta. What's interesting about this is that they have just evolved from shouting about do something to now really being involved in accountability and policy and a lot about justice. So that's what's very important here, is that the discussion is moving also within the youth to justice. And I know that Village has had some topics about climate justice. So here's my final slide. What's the 2026 sustainability outlook? The areas for leading EU companies, they're going to be focusing, as we said, on scope 3 emission reductions. And here they basically prioritize their top emitters, their top like maybe 20% of their emitters, and they collaborate to train, upskill, and support suppliers. This is important for them to reach their science-based targets. Topic of risk management for resiliency is key. So scenario analysis for climate and nature risks, ensuring and understanding whether your supply chain and where your supply chain might be disrupted, and also looking at resource availability. So you might have geographic exposure. Then eco-design and digital product passport, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be kind of a key thing. This will come hand in hand with LCA at scale. That means basically creating life cycle assessments for not just one product, but for an entire product portfolio. And then we have stakeholder engagement. This is now, people have measured, they've set targets, now they're starting to implement these roadmaps. And in order to implement something, we know it all comes down to people, right? So how do you engage them? How do you educate them? That's a key focus. And then how do you, set up your governance and incentive structures to support that? So thanks for your attention. You guys have been amazing, and also online. I hope that this has been an interesting, and to Village for giving me this opportunity.